This week on Jerusalem Dateline, the U.S. and Iran agreed to start indirect talks to re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal. Does this put Israel at risk? Plus, Iran and China agreed to a multi-year and multi-billion-dollar deal. And Israel remembers the Holocaust. We take a poignant look at the letters from that darkest chapter in the history of the Jewish people. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. On Thursday, April 8th, Israel marked Holocaust Remembrance Day to mourn the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust at the hands of the Nazis before and during World War II. A 2-minute siren sounded throughout the country as Israelis stood in silence to remember those lost in the darkest chapter in the history of the Jewish people. The night before, at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared Israel would not be bound by the Iranian nuclear deal.
Also to our best friends, I am saying, let there be no mistake. An agreement with Iran that will pave her way to a nuclear weapon, a weapon that is threatening our destruction. An agreement like that will not bind us in any way. There is only one thing that binds us: prevent those who strive to destroy us to carry out this plot.
Earlier in the week, the U.S. and Iran began indirect talks in Vienna to renew the Iranian nuclear agreement struck by President Obama in 2015, but ended in 2018 by President Trump. The development raises major concerns in Israel and the Middle East that it would accelerate Iran's road to nuclear weapons. The announcement came as 4 of the 5 powers who signed the 2015 nuclear deal met with Iranian officials in Vienna. Mediators arranged 2 working groups for the U.S. and Iran. One would discuss removing sanctions imposed by former President Trump, and the other would discuss Iran's enrichment of uranium. President Trump pulled out of the deal in May 2018, but President Biden made it one of his foreign policy priorities to re-enter the nuclear agreement.
We know these will be tough talks. We know there will be difficult discussions ahead, but again, this is a healthy step forward. It's a healthy step forward because it allows us to move forward with what we see is as the only path to achieve what President Biden and as a candidate Biden laid out, and that is a mutual return to compliance.
Since Biden became president, Iran began enriching uranium to 1 step below weapons-grade uranium. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned about re-entering the agreement.
We must not go back to the dangerous nuclear deal with Iran, because a nuclear Iran is an existential threat to the state of Israel and a great threat to the security of the entire world.
Others warn it gives in to Iran's demands.
The most expedient way to get a crisis with Iran over is to pay Iran's extortion racket. It's essentially a policy of appeasement, which allows you to at least get the crisis off the front burner, kick the can down the road until such time as Iran starts asking for more money or begins to escalate again.
For weeks, Iran and the U.S. have been at a stalemate. The U.S. said it wants Iran to reduce uranium enrichment before lifting sanctions, while Iran demanded the U.S. lift all sanctions before reducing enrichment. Complicating the geopolitics of the region, China's influence in the Middle East just got a lot bigger with the $400 billion economic deal with America's arch enemy in the region, Iran. The partnership comes as Tehran seeks relief from crippling U.S. sanctions, and China looks to expand its global influence.
First off, the deal means China gets to pour billions of dollars into Iran's banking, telecommunications, transportation, and infrastructure sectors over the next 25 years, including huge investments in nuclear power, ports, and oil and gas industries.
The cash infusion coming as the Islamic regime continues to endure the economic strain of U.S.-imposed sanctions and looks to China to ease their pain.
The investment for Iran means that China is backing it. And that is perhaps the most important benefit for Tehran. It knows that come hell or high water, Beijing will be behind it.
In exchange, Iran gives China a steady supply of oil to fuel its expanding economy. China imports more than 300,000 barrels of Iranian oil every day. This deal gives it even more oil at a deep discount.
Remember, the U.S. has sanctions on purchases of Iranian oil. And China, for the last year or so, has been buying it openly in violation of those sanctions. This is another indication, a sort of an in-your-face maneuver on the part of Beijing.
Partnership means the communist government now has a strategic foothold in a region historically dominated by U.S. influence.
The Chinese are solidifying economic relationships, not just with the Iranians, but across the Gulf as well. And I think most importantly, they are looking to use the Iranians as a pawn in the larger game of strategic competition against the West and in particular against America.
The agreement calls for closer military ties and more intelligence sharing. Experts warn the new China-Iran axis could mean potentially more money to fund the Islamic regime's proxy forces in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, and further destabilize the Middle East.
Because it gives Iran backing, undermines every other country's diplomacy in the region. This is going to be a problem not only for Washington, but also for Jerusalem. It's going to be a problem for the Sunni Arab states.
Shi Wei Wang, a Chinese-American, spent 40 months in an Iranian prison on alleged spy charges, gaining his freedom in a prisoner swap in 2019. He says the China-Iran deal is likely to force the Biden administration to give up more concessions as it seeks to rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal forged by President Obama and scrapped by President Trump. There's talk of a new proposal for Tehran with possible sanctions relief in coming weeks.
The Biden administration's eagerness to re-engage Iran is creating a conducive environment for China to entrench its influence and interest in Iran. And then if China can do that, other countries in the Middle East would be compelled to work with China closer.
As America pivots to Asia to confront Beijing's rise, it leaves a potential vacuum in the Middle East that has global powers like China and others only too happy to fill.
China, as well as Russia, are looking to capitalize on vacuums that the U.S. may leave, whether it's in the Levant or in the Persian Gulf, and use their military relationships, their economic relationships, and their political relationships to offset what they perceive to be declining U.S. power.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Up next, Israeli President Reuven Rivlin chooses Prime Minister Netanyahu to be the first party leader to form a coalition government. For the fourth time in 2 years, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to form a majority coalition government. Even if he succeeds, Netanyahu will face other challenges from outside, including President Biden's decisions on the Palestinians. Faced with a nearly impossible scenario, Prime Minister Netanyahu is aggressively taking up the challenge.
I will make every effort to take Israel out from the circle of recurring elections and to establish a strong government for all citizens of Israel.
In order to gain the 61 seats, Netanyahu would need the backing of Naftali Bennett's Yamina party and either the Islamist Ram party or defectors from other parties. Danny Danon, chairman of World Likud, sees a potential two-stage process.
The first stage is to get a government, regardless of the number of support we have, just to get the votes to pass it in the parliament. The second stage will be to bring more parties and to make it a stronger coalition.
Meanwhile, Israel is objecting to President Biden's decision to resume funding to the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA, the UN body overseeing Palestinian refugees.
In conversations with the U.S. State Department, I have expressed my disappointment and objection to the decision to renew UNRWA's funding without first ensuring that certain reforms, including stopping the incitement and removing anti-Semitic content from its educational curriculum, are carried out.
David Bedeen, whose organization monitors the UNRWA education system, says children are still taught to honor and appreciate those who attack Israel and its people.
How can you allocate funds to a school system which teaches the children to make war on a member state of the United Nations? There is no accountability procedure in UNRWA. This is an agency which has military training in the schools.
With the majority of its budget going to education, Bedin calls for UNRWA to be held responsible for what it teaches.
Donor nations could demand, number one, a disarming of the UNRWA camps. Number two, stopping military training in the camps. Number three, introducing concepts of peace education, of reconciliation with their Jewish neighbors, instead of saying the only solution for the Jewish neighbors is to make war on them.
Bedin maintains the priority should be investigating to understand what really goes on inside these camps, rather than just go with the flow and get excited about giving money to refugees. Coming up, some of the last letters from the Holocaust reveal the triumph and tragedy of the darkest chapter of the Jewish people. Each year, Israelis pause to remember the Holocaust, the slaughter of 6 million Jews by the Nazis and their collaborators. In talking about such a daunting subject, it's often hard to grasp the reality of each person's story, their life, family, hopes, and dreams. An online exhibit from Israel's Holocaust Museum aims to tell those stories. Before COVID pandemic hit, CBN's Scott Ross visited Yad Vashem in Jerusalem to bring us that story.
My dear Rosie, I am happy that you received our greetings. What are you up to, my darling? Be well. Many kisses from your mother.
In every letter at the beginning and at the end, she wrote, "Make sure to take care of your health."
That's the final letter Rosie Yoshkovitz received from her mother, Berta.
Each story is unique. In those online exhibitions, we are telling stories first to commemorate the victims, to give them back their names, human dignity.
Yona Kobo oversees the new exhibit, Last Letters from the Holocaust, 1943.
The letters were chosen because they are very intimate, very personal, very unique, because each handwriting is different from one person to the other. You can find stains of tears of those who wrote the letters and tears of those who received the letter.
When you read these letters from mothers, fathers, children, what does that do to your heart?
Sometimes it's tearing me apart. Sometimes I'm crying.
How were they delivered? Was there there was no postal service?
The post service worked the entire war, even in the camps.
Censorship?
Sometimes not, but I think they censored themselves.
Kobo gave us an extremely rare look at Yad Vashem's vast archives, where I saw some of the actual letters. What does this say?
That was written by a child. She was almost 12 years old. Her name was Regina Folkenflick, and she was living at East Poland. She was hidden at a Christian family. Her parents thought that was the best way to save her, by putting her in a good family. But the child was shot. The rest of the family survived. And her brother, now 84 years old, donated the letter to Yad Vashem. It's in Polish, and she's writing, "Dear mother and father and dear Dolik," her brother, "be well. Mommy, don't be upset. Please forgive me, Mommy, for writing so little."
And here's another one.
That is another one, written by a young woman, 19 years old, Rosette Bomblat. She was active in a group of underground movement in Paris. She helped saving other Jewish children. Her family was hidden in a village not far away from Paris. And Rosette is writing here in French, "I'm only living for the day that we will be together again." All the family, except of Rosette and her oldest sister Sarah, survived and emigrated to Israel.
She didn't?
She didn't. She was transferred to Auschwitz. She was murdered in the camp.
What about your family?
My mother was born in Germany, and she has been through a ghetto, a labor camp, and a very, very long death march. She marched 800 kilometers by foot. My father survived Auschwitz, and they met after the war was over. And when I was older, like 35 years old, my father remembered to tell me his secret. He was a widow when he met my mom. He lost his first wife and baby daughter in Belzec. I just recently found the name of his daughter.
This online exhibit is just one of many at Yad Vashem, the main collection of Holocaust documentation in the world.
So one of the main missions of Yad Vashem is to collect into one place all the documents, all the evidence about the fate of Jews during the Holocaust. It was the first intention of Holocaust survivors the first day after the war was ended.
Dr. Chaim Gertner is director of the archives.
We understood that the Nazis not only planned to murder the Jews, but also understood or wanted to annihilate, to erase our ability to know who were they and what happened to them.
Erase their memory.
So this is why Yad Vashem decided as one of its most important missions to collect all those pieces of huge puzzle of our joint history into one place.
The more than 200 million pages of documentation includes testimony, survivors' stories, photos, and other personal items.
We launched 7 years ago a national campaign. We call it Gathering the Fragments. We met until now close to 11,000 people who donated to us during the last 7 years more than 124,000 items and collections.
And are there many survivors living today that have seen this, been here, and experienced this?
Yes, Holocaust survivors do see Yad Vashem as the home of their items, and they say here it will be kept forever. Here preserve it. And I may tell you the story, for example, of this sweater over here.
Yes.
That was donated to us on the first day of this campaign 7 years ago by a lady from Tel Aviv. It was belonged to her sister. So for her, it took a lot of time to decide to separate with that.
The name Yad Vashem comes from the Bible. It means a memorial and a name.
Yad Vashem during the last 2 decades and more is struggling to tell the story of individuals in the Holocaust. They were human beings that used to live in Europe and elsewhere, and they had lives, they had kids, they had dreams, and it tells us also something about their ability to survive during those years in those inability times.
How important is it to have all this online?
Around 1 million visitors are coming to Yad Vashem every year. Almost 10,000 of them are visiting our reading room every year. But last year, more than 19 million people all over the world, Jews and non-Jews, used our databases online.
Because you're around this and have explored this and researched it, do you become jaded at all? I mean, it has to affect your heart.
I am a son of a Holocaust survivor myself.
I was going to ask you that.
I think that as an educator, our mission here to educate the next generation is what gives us the strength to think ahead, what to do with that story for generations to come.
Scott Ross for CBN at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem.
Coming up, generations of one Jewish family serve in the military to preserve the destiny of the Jewish people. As we mentioned, Israel is honoring the memory of the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. But there were other Jews who fought in the U.S. military, enabling a victory for the world, their country, and ultimately the Jewish people. More than 75 years later, one soldier in the Israel Defense Forces told CBN News how his family's 300-year history of military service on 3 continents closed the gap, taking them through World War II and finally home to Israel. Here's Julie Stahl with that story.
At age 18, Jesse Ebner immigrated to Israel to enter the IDF and fulfill a family tradition that goes back generations.
I knew I was going to the military based off of my family's history that everybody for the past 300 years has been in one military or another, starting back in the Austrian Empire all the way to the United States. And I decided that I had to come here for ideological reasons.
Ebner's grandfather and great-uncles fought with the American military during World War II. Those great-uncles helped defeat Nazi Germany and liberate the Dachau concentration camp.
One brother was in the 101st Airborne. They liberated the Dachau internment camp. And his other brother was in the 1st Infantry Division, and he landed also at the D-Day landings.
Meanwhile, grandfather Jacob served in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese.
My grandfather, he was a Seabee. A Seabee is a combat engineer in the Navy, and during World War II, Their job was to open the way for the Marines to land on the beaches to fight the Japanese. So he was in Iwo Jima, he was in Guadalcanal. His job was to get onto the beach, defuse mines, to stop tank traps, in order for the Marines to be able to have a successful invasion of these islands.
This military heritage that began centuries ago also led to a name change.
We originally were the Cohen family, and they decided that they wanted to be officers in the Austrian military, so they bought the last name Ebner, which was a nice Austrian last name. And it just continued up until my father himself was a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force.
Ebner now feels his family has come full circle.
I think partially it was hearing about the experiences of my grandfather and his brothers to find something that I could fight for, and I saw Israel. It's our homeland, and it's something that we can fight for now, and it's something that exists. And it might have been something that 300 years ago my family would have liked to have done but did not have the opportunity to do it. Something that I feel could close the circle also of my grandfather's brother who liberated the camp, the people that were in the camps now, that we can stand up for ourselves.
With anti-Semitism on the rise around the world, Ebner says it's important for Israel to be here for the Jewish people and for the IDF to be able to protect it.
I'm happy to wake up every day to know that I'm doing my part to make sure that the world's a little bit safer. We're on the front lines of what could happen to the world, and that's why we need to be the strongest we can be and keep up what we're doing, because I believe the IDF is the strongest army in the world and that we're ready for whatever our neighborhood can throw at us.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Rehovot, Israel.
Well, that's one example of how the Jewish people have survived through the ages and why many proclaim, Am Israel High, the people of Israel live. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blasts so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time